And I approached the collaborative process up in Whitefish. We're all products of our experiences in life. And so kind of how we come to think about things is formulated by what we've done in life. And to begin with, I want to start by talking a little bit about my experiences in my tie to Bozeman. I'm an old guy, almost 68, and I was a student here back in the 1960s, a very turbulent time. And in fact, I was a student body president here in the 1969-1970 school year, which was the year of the Kent State incident. And I see some people with a little gray would probably remember that. Excuse me. We had the reputation as the cow college. We were way more conservative than the dancing school over at Missoula. And we were mostly kind of conservative leaning farm and ranch kids. So anyway, there was a pretty good reason to be concerned about violence taking place here. I know that might sound hard to believe, but boy, the Kent State incident was a terrible, troublesome thing. Some kids in Kent State, Ohio University got in the wrong place at the wrong time, and some National Guardsmen, also young, basically kids, felt threatened, and some guns went off, and some people were killed. And it made huge national headlines. It was a most unfortunate, tragic incident that wasn't really anybody's fault, but it resulted in just an explosion of outrage in college campuses all over the country. And the students from the colleges in the eastern part of the United States just dropped out of school. The college just closed down. And the kids flooded to Washington, D.C. and basically just laid siege to the national capital. And so that was going on here to some extent too. And there was just a fervor of outrage, especially among college-age people. And so when this became pretty apparent to me, I thought, well, what we needed to do was to do something and make it possible for people to protest, but in a responsible way. And so we persuaded the administration to close all the campuses, or all the classes. Must have been 2 days or something after the incident occurred. And we lowered the flag to half-mast, and we put a microphone or a sound system beside it, so all the people who wanted to could vent on any side of the Vietnam War issue that they wanted to on. And then the student government paid for sending telegrams. Probably nobody here hardly remembers what a telegram is. We set up these tables, and you could send a telegram to Henry Kissinger or President Nixon or Secretary of State Rogers. Or there was a guy named Louis B. Hershey, who was the director of the draft, whatever that was, selective service. And so they bombarded him with telegrams. And also to our congressional delegation that was then made up of Senator Mansfield and Senator Metcalf and Congressman Olson and Congressman Melcher. But anyway, we sent thousands of telegrams. Some kids would send, half a dozen of them to different people. And it kind of helped to lance the boil, and then we followed that up by taking a survey, not only of the students here at the MSU campus, but the ones from the other campuses around Montana. So then there was something like 30,000 students or something in the whole university system, and we did a scientific job of coming up with a survey of their opinions. And then I went back to Washington, D.C. with another kid who was coming in as student body president after me. His name was Kelly Addy. Some of you may know him. He went on to serve as a legislator in Billings. So Kelly and I went back to Washington, D.C., and remember I told you that the Capitol had just been taken over. I remember we left the hotel where we were staying downtown on the first morning, and we got to a place called DuPont Circle. You might be familiar with that, those of you who've been to Washington, D.C. And it was absolutely plugged up with human bodies. These protesting kids from all over the country had laid down in that circle, and of course you know the way that Washington, D.C. street system works, is that circles, the streets come into like spokes on a wheel, and if you could completely make it impossible to get through the circle, you could make it impossible to get through Wisconsin Avenue, Massachusetts Avenue, all these kind of avenues. So Anyway, we sat there for about an hour and we watched the police drag these kids out of the circle. And there wasn't any violence or anything, but as soon as they'd get some of them out, more of them would go back in. And it was just an almost impossible situation. Washington, D.C. was essentially paralyzed. We got up to Capitol building, and we may have known this beforehand, but there had been an agreement that was brokered shortly before we got there between Senator Mark Hatfield and the protesting kids. He was kind of the key guy. And the idea was that Congress could do its work in the morning and then they'd listen to the protesters in the afternoon. So you couldn't hardly walk through any corridor or any hallway. There were students with backpacks, some of them stayed there all night, and you couldn't get through almost any office building without having to step over humanity. But the members of Congress were allowed to go through those hallways to their committee meetings and back again, and their offices and so on in the morning to do their job. And then in the afternoon, the agreement was they'd stay in their offices, and the kids would be able to come in and talk to them about their opposition to the Vietnam War and the draft and so forth. And it was a kind of a neat deal. I mean, it was an incredible experience for me. But when we go into these offices, all the rest of the kids would basically harangue the congressman or senator, and Kelly and I had this survey of all the college kids in the whole state, albeit a small state. So we could say, well, 33% of the college kids in Montana think this, and 41% think this, and so on and so forth. And we had something more definitive to work with than anybody else had. And so they were somewhat impressed with that. I remember, anybody here remember Senator Metcalf? Senator Lee Metcalf? He was a big, very tousled sort of a guy. His hair looked like, he used overused expression, his hair looked like it had been combed with an egg beater, but it kind of did. And he was always kind of disheveled and tousled looking and that sort of thing. And while he was in more or less sympathy, I think, with the kids who were protesting the Vietnam War, he was horribly offended and his world was disrupted by all these damn kids flooding into the Capitol building and messing up the whole legislative process. So to go along with the agreement, in the afternoon, he'd open up his office, but he interpreted his office to be his little personal office. Most of these guys have a waiting room with a few stuffed chairs and that sort of thing, and you couldn't get as many people in this room, but you could probably get half as many people in this room, sort of semi-comfortably out there. Well, Metcalf's private office was about maybe 20 feet by 15 feet or something, maybe not even that big. And he had huge stacks of newspapers, and everything seemed to be covered with about 1/8 of an inch of dust. And he had this cat that was perched on top of the stacks of newspapers, or sometimes on his desk, or sometimes in his lap. And so we could wedge about 14 kids, I think, in that little tiny office, and he enjoyed that. He told me afterwards he did. He wanted to make it as uncomfortable for him as possible because they were disrupting his life to the extent that they were. And he sat there and looked kind of curmudgeonly, as all the kids talked to him, and then they left. But since I'd given the presentation that time, and he held me back, and he told me how much he appreciated that we had done something of substance other than to just harangue him. So, and we had another conversation too. I don't have time to go into now, but it was really an interesting one. And I maintained communication with him after that. He was a very liberal Democrat, and he and I were on the same philosophical wavelength, but I think I may have earned his respect a little bit that day. And he was a man of great substance, although he was grouchy and irritable and so on. And I think almost everybody who knew him knew that about him. Well, anyway, I don't know where I am in my notes here. Let's see. Well, I'll go here. And this is connected somewhat to this meeting here today, too. We got back from Washington, D.C. at about the time that the first Earth Day observance was being celebrated here at Montana State University. And it was by someone who I think other people here in the room would also remember and probably know, and that's Dorothy Bradley. She was a graduate student from Colorado who came back to Montana State. Her mother was ill at the time. And she was an environmentalist. And we, most of us never heard of environmentalists before. And I remember she came and talked to me about it, and she said she needed the student government's help if we could in organizing this Earth Day. And she told me about, I don't even remember, Silent Spring and somebody or other and those authors back in that day and age. But it was pretty provocative stuff, And so I agreed to help her, and in the process learned a lot about the consideration about the environment and how we had to be mindful of it and recognize that humankind can have an impact on the world in which we live, and we've got to be vigilant to make sure we take care of what nature provided for us in an intelligent, long-term way. Well, anyway, that began a lifelong friendship, which still endures, and I was interested intensely in politics, and so was she, more focused on this environmental issue. So we filed for the legislature that spring together, and we maximized the amount of attention we got because she filed as a Democrat and I filed as a Republican. And we were both successful. And over the years, this goes back now something over 40 years, we haven't been in close collaboration, but we've maintained a good line of communication, and fairly frequently, as I think about it, we've shared thoughts and ideas just on an informal basis for a long time. And we both lost close races for governor. So we've had some parallels in our lives. We've had some things in common. And she has been in trouble off and on in her party for being a little bit too much of an independent thinker. She had a heck of a battle on her hands to get the Democratic nomination to run for governor because of her openness to a sales tax. And I had a pretty good fight in the Republican primary because I was regarded as a rhino, a Republican in name only, by some more conservative than me. So we've got some things in common. But I think most of all, an enduring friendship and a respect for each other's ideas, even though they're not always the same, frequently not always the same. In terms of my personal background, I was brought up in the Flathead Valley, and little grain and cattle ranch, and my dad had to sell logging equipment to support the ranch. Not very many ranches support families without some help. And so we raised grain and cattle, and my dad sold logging equipment, and that's how we essentially made our living. And so most of his friends were loggers and sawmillers and that sort of thing. And on my school bus, the kids were farm kids, or they were from logging and sawmill families. So I kind of grew up with the idea that multiple use is a good concept, and we had the multiple use movement was just developing then. And so many families had these green signs, including us, out by the mailbox or in front of the house, said this family supported by timber dollars. And I grew up in that culture, I grew up in that world. I grew up believing that as long as the rain falls and the sun shines, it doesn't require any electrical power or any other kind of power or energy. It doesn't create any pollution. Wood just reproduces itself by a natural process. And if you don't cut it any faster than it grows, and you're careful where you cut it, you can have it forever. And it's compatible with other uses. And I grew up believing that, and I still believe that. I think that people, if they want to work with each other, and there's a large enough landscape for them to do so, that most all uses, economic, recreational, and natural and environmental, are compatible with each other. But it requires a good faith relationship between and among people for that to happen, but it can happen, and I know it can happen. So anyway, I spent about 30 years in elective office. I continued in the legislature after after Dorothy and I first ran back in 1970. And I spent a lot of that time alternatively chairing the education and taxation committees in the state senate, because most of the time I was in the legislature, I was in the state senate. And that was a whole lot different era than this one. And from having personally lived through it, I know from living through it how different it was. I mean, I haven't served in the legislature now for close to 20 years, but just keeping in touch with legislators and my newspaper readers' understanding of it makes me understand how different the process is. I was influenced heavily by a gentleman named Gene Turnage, who was the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court for about 16 years after he left the legislature, but he made a great impression on me. He was from Polson, and I was from Whitefish, and so we were able to attend interim committee meetings together, and he usually arranged for me to be on what he was on. And I remember him saying that it was a real good policy for us Republicans to always leave the Democrats a place to stand. And I said, well, I think I know what you mean by that. Tell me. And he said, well, we've got philosophical differences that we could magnify or we can minimize them. Kind of depends on what we want to do. But regardless of how important we think our position is and how uncompromisable we think it is, or the opposite of that, how compromisable we think it is, we should always treat them fairly. And if we've got the majority, the people voted to give us the majority, then they expect a conservative imprimatur to be on the legislation we pass. But that doesn't mean that you jerk the buttons off their shirt and poke their eyes out and send them home in disgrace. You know, it means that you treat them fairly. You could have taken the whole loaf, but you take 2/3 of the loaf. And they understand that, and then when they get in the majority, as Montana is a competitive enough state, at least it was more so then, they'll treat us in the same fair way. And so instead of having radical change that might occur and then not be sustained, because the majority would change and they'd repeal all the stuff we passed because we just passed it with partisan muscle, and then they do the same thing to us, we'll just take the ship of state in a little bit more conservative direction. When they get in, they'll take it in a little bit more liberal direction. Things remain relatively stable. There is change, and it can be real change, but it can be sustainable and well thought out change. So I operated pretty much in all my years in politics according to that idea. The idea basically that everybody's entitled to their say, but nobody's entitled to their way. That you've got to, everything in politics involves compromise. Everything involving people involves compromise. If you've got a relationship between people and there never has to be any compromise, that must mean that one person's doing the thinking for everybody. And if we're all willing to agree to that, if we just want somebody to dictate to us what we should think, then there's no need for compromise. But especially in a legislative body, in a marriage, compromise is fundamentally necessary, but especially in a legislative body. And our system was designed to require compromise because we've got a Senate, a House of Representatives, a President, and a court system. And so if any legislation is going to pass, it's got to pass those bodies, even if they're all dominated by the same political party. There will be some give and take and compromise. It's inherent in our process. It's inherent in the way our process was designed. And it's been going on since the beginning of the history of our country and the beginning of the history of any country that has a functional process based on government by the consent of the governed. So anyway, I grew up with that system, and I realized that most people are in good faith. The horrible liberal Democrats with whom I disagree, and now some of the horrible conservative Republicans that I can't agree with very much either anymore, they all think they're right. Very few people think I'm wrong, and I know I'm wrong, and I'm going to impose my wrongness on everybody else. Almost no one thinks that. They think they're right, and they in good faith think they're right. So you've got to get them talking to each other. And if you can get them talking to each other, and they can kind of lower their suspicions and try to genuinely think about what the other person thinks and where he's coming from, then you can reach some kind of a consensus. But it requires good faith communication. It has to happen. And I think it's actually become a little more difficult in the context of modern politics than it was when I was involved back in the 70s and 80s and 90s. After my defeat for governor in 2004, I pretty much dropped out of politics. I was a high school history and government teacher, a legislator for most of my life, and I continued to teach over at the University of Missoula. Almost hesitate to admit that, but it's a good place. It's a good place. I have many friends there. In fact, I learned a tremendous amount there. You know, when you live in a different community, you know, I grew up in the Flathead Valley, different people, a different outlook, and that sort of thing. But I learned a lot from living at the University of Montana, and I'm grateful for that opportunity. And I still teach. I still teach one class on the Civil War at the university. I do so in the fall semester, and I also taught the same class. I'm no longer teaching it at Flathead Valley Community College in the spring semester. Now what I do pretty much is I'm involved in the Montana Historical Society in a major way, and I write a newspaper column about once a month, which I think appears in the Bozeman Chronicle some of the time. So how did I, with this background, retired teacher and a former politician, how did I end up being the chairman and basically assuming the role of the leadership of the Whitefish Range Partnership? Well, this guy was a reporter for the Missoulian newspaper named Michael Jameson. For many years, he lived up in the Flathead Valley, and he interviewed me. I can't even know how many times. So he and I knew each other pretty well. We've even gone fishing pretty extensively together up in the Whitefish Range, so it was beyond a professional relationship, it was a personal relationship. And now he works for the National Parks Conservation Association up in Glacier Park. So they called me on the telephone and he explained to me that the Flathead National Forest was about to go through this planning process, and that he had been instrumental in helping organize a collaborative, and he explained what a collaborative was and that sort of thing, and talked a little bit about how we needed to get everybody together in advance of the regular Forest Service planning process so that we could kind of get control of it as local folks. And so I, was interested in this and that sort of thing. And so I said, well, that's neat, Michael, but why me? And he said, well, because I know you. And he said, we've got people that have not liked each other very well, that we're going to have to get in the same room and they're going to have to work with each other. And you've got some real skills in making that happen. And he said, furthermore, he said, I checked around quite a bit. He said, a couple of my associates have checked around quite a bit too. And he said, Bob, he said, absolutely nobody thinks you're a son of a bitch. I mean, well, anyway, that's a kind of a negative way of presenting me with a compliment, I guess. But so, anyway, so I agreed to do this, and I knew it would take a huge amount of time, but I thought it was really a worthwhile thing, and I still do. You could bring people together on something as important as 300 and some thousand acres of landscape that's vital to everybody. And so we started out with about 20 so-called stakeholders, and that was enlarged to about 30 before our process was done. And the way that worked was if anybody wanted to bring somebody else in that they thought needed to be represented and hadn't been, that they just recommend that person and we'd bring them in. We never even had an argument about anybody that was proposed. We had a couple of folks who later were pretty grumpy about what we had done and criticized us, who came to meetings. I think each one came to one meeting and thought, this is kind of boring. These guys aren't really doing anything, and so they didn't come back again. And then when we got done and we'd come together pretty well and we had unanimous consent on some fairly big decisions and that sort of thing, and they were in the newspapers, then these guys paid attention to us. And they could have been involved all along if they had chosen to be, at least as far as I know they could have. But anyway, that just didn't happen. One thing we did agree to, though, was that the U.S. Forest Service not be a participant. We did this entirely independent of the Forest Service. And we met for about 3 months, I think. We met twice a month, every 2 weeks. And so we probably went through 5, 6, 7 meetings before it seemed to make sense, since questions would come up that they could be a real important resource for us, to invite them to come and be available as a resource for questions and to provide advice and that sort of thing. That worked out really very well. They were really helpful. And they didn't try to influence us in any, they just answer a question and respond as directly and honestly as they could. So anyway, I think that worked out well. And we divided our group into what we called subcommittees. We had 10 of them. And they represented in this interest area that was important to each stakeholder. So, you know, like fisheries and stream bed management, high intensity recreation, snowmobiling, summer wheeled motorized vehicles, timber and recreation, wilderness, backcountry trails, weed management, so forth. And we also agreed to a values statement, and I think this was really critical. We gave some thought to this, and I'm not going to quote the whole thing, but I'm going to quote to you part of it here. Our shared vision for the Whitefish Range is to ensure a balance of traditional and modern land uses. The unique qualities of this mountain region should be maintained, and the range should continue to provide multiple use values, including both motorized and non-motorized recreation. Sustainable forestry, sustainable forestry, wildland restoration, hunting, fishing, and unique opportunities for backcountry solitude. We recognize that change is a constant. Even the remote North Fork River Valley is not immune, and that people are a central component to this landscape. Yet we also submit that as we adapt to inevitable change, our waters should remain clean, our wildlife habitat connected, our fisheries robust, and our economy vital. The Whitefish Range, at the heart of glacier country, should remain a critical part of our unique way of life and a key component to the local identity of our tightly knit communities. In order that this region remain rural in its nature, and that our public access be maintained, and that our neighbors be educated about the region's unique values, and that we sustain the historic traditions for which the Whitefish Range has come to be known, we must work in a collaborative manner. If we do not act deliberately and do not plan together for changing times, then the future of this place almost certainly will be decided by others. And so with that, everyone agreeing to that, and everyone agreeing to that in good faith, and recognizing that in our rules, unanimity was required for each recommendation, the understanding was that no individual should deliberately try to blow this thing up, that we're going to make a good faith effort to help each other and arrive at a positive conclusion. And each subcommittee, of course, was greatly involved in professional testimony. They might not report back for a couple of months, and then when they did, they'd almost always bring an expert or two that say these guys or this testimony was important and what caused us to arrive at the conclusions we did. And they were always unanimous, and they were always made up of wilderness advocates and multiple use advocates and forest people and snowmobile people and that sort of thing. But I tried to keep them small. I tried to keep the subcommittee small, but anybody that wanted to be on the subcommittee could be on the subcommittee. And the emphasis was always that by cooperating with each other, we could create a more positive outcome for everybody. Remember, when I was down at the University of Montana at the Center for the Rocky Mountain West and later at the Mansfield Center, one of my colleagues was former Congressman Pat Williams. And he and I are mostly Irish, both of us. So we laugh at the same things, and we both kind of like stories and that kind of stuff. Remember, one of the things Pat shared with me one time that I shared with the collaborative group was he said, he said, as great a place as Butte, Montana is, probably the greatest city in the state of Montana, certainly in Montana, and probably in the whole country. Even as great a place as Butte, Montana is, it couldn't put a man on the moon by itself. He said, we had to have the rest of you helping us to do that. Well, I told them that. I said, you might be able to make the best debater's case in the world for greatly expanded wilderness area or greatly expanded snowmobile opportunities or whatever. But if you're trying to get that accomplishment yourself through this extremely complicated Forest Service planning process after we're done with our collaborative, and say the collaborative falls apart, you don't have anybody helping you, you're probably not going to succeed. But think of how much stronger you'd be as a snowmobile advocate if the wilderness guys came in support of you, and vice versa. Because we're a band of brothers. here in our collaborative, and we're going to stick together and help each other. And we're going to know why this recommendation that's important to this is defensible, and it ought to happen, and it ought to be a part of the whole process. So the idea was that we understood that we're each trying to help our own point of view individually, but we're going to help each other, we're a part of a much greater process. And if we look at it that way, a whole lot more can be accomplished. And so what developed from that, I think, was a pretty good spirit, and I encourage that at every opportunity. We got them working with each other to help each other. And sometimes decisions were postponed. Sometimes the subcommittee would come in with a unanimous recommendation, but there'd be some heartburn and we'd have to come back and revisit it, sometimes even more than once. But ultimately, what prevailed was this idea that if we're going to accomplish something, and we've already adopted this recommendation and this recommendation and this recommendation, and we've got something happening and it's going down the road, and we don't want to miscarry it now. So let's figure out a way to make it work. And we were successful. We ended up recommending 81,000 additional acres of wilderness that was unanimously agreed to. 72,000 acres of non-motorized backcountry. We increased the timber base on the 309,000 acre Whitefish Range. We didn't increase it, we recommended increase. From 54,000 acres to 90,000 acres. And all these interest groups agreed with all of this. We recommended, this was a kind of a new thing, we recommended a new, what we call front country recreation designation for the area that's most used now for recreation and where there's been the most contention. And we persuaded the non-motorized advocates and the wilderness advocates that, look, these areas, and they're for the most part near Big Mountain, near Whitefish Mountain, and not too far north of Columbia Falls or north of Whitefish, up in the upper Whitefish Lake area, that are really work well for recreationalists. That the wilderness people would back away from that, and that at the same time the recreational people would support the 81,000 acres of additional wilderness area. Because if they helped each other, they were both going to win. If they fought each other, they were both going to lose. In the front country recreation area, we were able to make possible a lot more opportunities for mountain bikers, for four-wheelers, for snowmobilers, for cyclists, backcountry cyclists, and the Forest Service, of course, would have to cooperate with this, but we tried to make recommendations that they could easily cooperate with. And we agreed as the process, the formal Forest Service process unfolded, to help each other with all these recommendations. So, in conclusion, I just want to emphasize that good rules are important to any collaborative kind of an arrangement, or any legislative kind of arrangement, or anything. It's good to have common sense rules that everybody understands, that everybody believes are fair, and that everybody respects. And so if you've got good rules in your collaborative, you'll have a functional collaborative. But good faith, not just good rules, but good faith is absolutely necessary to a successful outcome of any process that involves people. So you need the good rules, but you also need good faith. And you need to be able to sit down across the table and look each other in the eye and think, I'm going to try to be a part of the solution here instead of part of the problem, and I'm going to work in good faith with all the other people to make a positive outcome happen. And it can happen, I promise you, if you do that.